October 25, 899. The year our Lord. Finan, Utah's Irishman stroked down both sides of his beard with one hand as his torch illuminated the antechamber of the fetid dungeon in which he had found his best friend. Beyond the bars, he could just make out the prisoner hanging by his wrists, head slumbered down, black and blue and bruised, bleeding. Whoever had enacted the punishment had done a good job. Lord. He shook Utah by the shoulder, pushing away an empty ale jar from the table. He was lying in some of it which had spilled, and Finan pulled him to a sitting position. Lord, Finan said gently, his eyes going back to the cell. The body was in a poor shape. What did he do? Offended me. Finan chuckled as Utah lay his head back down on the table. I needed to see it done. Finan backed away. When Utah was in one of those moods it was best to leave him. I am guessing you are not coming home tonight, his friend said, then left him to his beer. Utah passed back out. But the prisoner was no longer chained 5 minutes later. Ethelwold had left the chains free for her hands, but her muscles were stiff and it had taken a good while for her to shake them free. The cell door was locked, of course. And she was cold. Abhorrent though it was, Osrith managed to gather Ethelwold's wool cloak about her damaged body, her own clothes rags on the floor. There was no escape. She was to be declared a witch. At least hanging would be quick, possibly. For there was 2 ways to hang a person, a slow way and a fast way. Nevertheless, Osrith was willing to bet that the pain would not exceed that which she had experienced at the hands of the king's nephew. And then she saw it. From the light of one of the almost burned torches hanging in a steel bracket on the wall, something glittered, milky white, and Osrith stared at it for a moment. The jewel sat in a clasp made for it by a blacksmith working in Bernicia. Many craftsmen gained knowledge of exotic gemstones, but this, Eric had explained, had come from a river mollusk from the Tuide River. It shone in the gloom as beautifully as it would have done in the dark waters of that northern river when first an eye saw it and a hand reached out to encapsulate it in their fingers. From the table beyond, Osrith could hear the deep snoring grunts of her drunk brother, lying in the spillage of the ale, and she let the air from her lungs, wincing at pain that had not been there earlier. He had watched. Utah did not know that she was his sister, but to any person, a woman especially, it took some kind of sickness of the mind to allow another person to abuse them so badly. Osrith's fingers still worked, mostly, and she flexed them as much as she could bear to take up the jewel, walking tenderly across the straw-covered floor. The soles of her feet were, at least, one part of her body Ethelwold had not damaged, and her boots were at the gates, waiting, she supposed, for someone to claim them, for the prisoner would not need them. For the prisoner's path led only one way. Osrith put them on before approaching the cell gates again, and found it surprisingly easy to get the catch into the lock and wriggle it so that the pins in the casing were all lined up, the metal acting like the head of a keywood. The catch clicked, and the cell door swung outwards. She grabbed it, and pulled it to, withdrawing her jewel, watching for any sign that her disturbance had alerted anyone. But not even her brother shifted his head. She gathered up the cloak about her, before finding her boots, and pushed her unstockinged feet into them, Osrith's soles pushing against the joins of the leather. But, that was the least of her pain, for it seemed as if every sinew of her body was on fire. There was a click behind her, as one moved. Utah had pushed back into his chair, and his eyes were now open, blurred, trying to focus. When he realized it was his prisoner stealing away, he tried to raise his head, calling out that she was a dead bastard and that she was to come back. Creochnaik seemth oin. Osrith croaked back. Nam gast huort. Faedis swelsfn. I will kill you, Utah threatened, which was a laughable threat, for he was having trouble even standing. Lord. Osrith heard someone call. Utah turned his head to look, and did not see Osrith reach to the armory wall and grab a spear. I will kill you. He threatened again, as boots stamped down the passageway. Whoever it was a good 5 minutes away, for there were many gated entrances between them and this dungeon. But Osrith knew another way, and it was the way she was going to take. Duindu Gob. She shouted to her brother, as he stumbled against the table, now more alert than Osrith supposed. I will kill you. Not if I kill you first. Osrith managed, and plunged the spear she was holding towards him, pain searing down her arm, and she let go of the shaft, for she had embedded it into Utad's hand, pinning him to the wooden table. No time to run, but, unbelievably, the silver she had brought for Ethelwold, originally stolen from Utad, was sitting in its bag by the air grate. She pushed it through while, behind her, her brother fought to free himself from his pinioned situation as more voices called to him. Osrith ignored it all. There was a vent, no more than a few bricks wide, which would get her to the room beyond, the guard room where Stepa slept. She had discovered the way, once, when she had, ironically, been hiding from Ethelwold and had climbed down, and back up again. Stepa was on duty now, Osrith knew, for she had heard his whistling above, at courtyard level, as he patrolled. But it was painful, and it took all of Osrith's strength to get her up into the channel, and heave herself onwards, pushing the silver before her, but, finally, she managed to tumble unceremoniously onto the cold floor of the armory. Shirts and breeches lay in piles, newly laundered, Osrith supposed, and she scooped up clothing. Up there. Osrith heard Utad say, and she realized she had no time to dress. Instead, she bundled all of her things together and snuck out of the postern gate, hurrying around the inside perimeter of the courtyard. A voice called to her. Osrith knew not what they said in her haste, and she got through to the outer palisade, and through the kitchen postern. Tired, limping and sore, Osrith took all she had to Allah. No arrogant demanding this time, Osrith needed to beg the woman for help. If the Briton did not help, Osrith knew her life was over. 88,888,888. She could go to Alba, to Domhnall. She could no longer remain here. He's a piece of shit. She was in his arms, in her boarding house, just her and him together, forgetting the world, just them, together. 88,888,888. Osrith did not know how long she remained with Allah. She did remember the day she had opened her eyes and seen the healer, but could not move. She did remember the healer telling her of the Battle of Catrach, beginning, Gwarueth Ododinch Worthin Ognor, Chwent Trinalane Enem Dully or, and finishing, Rugsayu in New Earth Igdissa, Igkinagna. It was a catastrophic defeat, Osrith knew. Njd and Pickland were broken apart, atomized to almost the basic level of subsistence, for all lords needed the farmer to grow the food and know how to store it. There was a gentle melancholy about it all, a story, a history all together, meaning and interest and culture together. It suited Osrith that here was a detachment from the woman who was healing her. A chasm, where cultures, though fitted by each other like Tessera on the floor of an old Roman villa, were unconnected. Make a plan, any plan that is good for you, Osrith, Allah had told her, then had sung on. This time Taliesin, the poet, lifted her ears to the Gwenstrad, when Prince Urien fought at a forded river, forth the Picts at dawn, and won. Osrith. That was something of note. The Britons did not, as a rule, acknowledge personal names of Saxons. Acknowledgement was acceptance, and Britons had little of their own, so it was understandable that they wished to use it sparingly. Where are you going? If the Saxons had not noticed, and Osrith guessed someone would, she had. Far fewer Britons were on the mud streets of the poor settlement without the city walls. That was the day Osrith felt strong enough to stand at the front of Allah's house, the familiar smell of the morning's broth permeating the air. Cymru. Hywel will take us. She reached for Osrith's hand, then her other, and encouraged her to squeeze hers. Her strength was returning. Allah had shared, because Osrith had shared. She had told Allah, once, her mother had been of Vashd, and her ancestor was Urien. It was when she was singing Taliesin, and Osrith remembered the same song. Then, on the morning Osrith found she could walk, more or less, Allah had another question for her. How long since you last had your bleeding? It has been 2 months since your warrior brought you. Osrith did not know. Your body needs treating, Allah told her. Old battle wounds, Osrith suggested, vaguely. She watched Allah's daughter dismantle a washing stand, bundling up the wood. Not that there wasn't wood in Cymru, Osrith supposed. It would be significant to them, a reason linked to their heathen faith, perhaps. No battle caused this, Allah told her, anger in her words. I warned you last time. If I had not kept my counsel, others would have died, Osrith told her, and she looked about Allah's home and the slow, systematic abandonment of their settlement, where Britons had probably lived for millennia. Allah understood, and busied herself with herbs from the bowls by her pot. You need some rue, monkshood, lily root. Osrith lifted her head at the ingredients list, as Allah's pot released a slow, steady cloud of steam as it began to boil. There is a child, Osrith. How long? She brought her yellowed arm and put her hand to her mouth. How long? Allah asked her. Since you came last. 2 months. Be certain. No more than 3. It is within the time you came to me, Allah told her, narrowing her lips, eyes looking at her depleted stores. You were attacked then? Have I really been here that long? Osrith wondered. I track the moon, Allah shrugged. Ethelwold. Even though it could be Edward's or Finan's, Osrith's heart knew it was him. His attack on her was monstrous, horrific, depraved. If he had learned it with the Danes, Osrith was certain it was not the Danes she had known. I am going north. There were hoards of silver she would steal. It would not take much to reach Hampton. I cannot have a child, this child, any child. Allah turned and looked at her, slowly, and contemplated Osrith. I will do this, but it must be the last time. Your body is damaged, even if you choose birth it may be the death of you. This, she gestured to the pot, where a yellow-green mush was forming a foam near the top, may be the best for you in any case. She crossed to Osrith. You are of Urian's line. If I were to ask anything of you at all, Osrith, I wish that you discover the depth of meaning of that, for yourself. 88,888,888. And so, a bodily healed, single-minded Osrith strode towards the market square of Winchester, to an untrained eye no different than she had been a few weeks before. She was meant to be Edward's guard, but nothing would compel her to the palace. Instead, she turned to the western streets that would lead her to her rooms, and when she got there Osrith found waiting for her was a man she knew. Aldhelm picked his head up and his face brightened when he saw her. Where have you been? He asked, crossing to her. His face dropped a little when he realized something was not quite right. Unwell, Osrith replied, laconically. Are you well enough to join us again? I need reliable people on guard, under the circumstances. He smiled his usual encouraging smile. I do not believe that I have anything you require. You have one lady in Mercia, Osrith thought, bitterly. I would be too much trouble at the present time, Osrith told him. Aldhelm sighed, visibly, and laid a hand delicately on her shoulder. Osrith, I do not know what precisely has happened to you, what has kept you from your duty. He cleared his throat. While I wish to see you back with us, I will respect your decision. Osrith flinched. She had spent much time hardening her heart, but Aldhelm's humility made Osrith cringe at her own harshness. What happened? A very good question. Osrith looked at him in silence for a moment. I met my match in an opponent, she replied, slowly. I was not clever enough to get away, I was trapped. Osrith! He exclaimed. What can I do? But Osrith shook her head. Allow me to say that I can no longer serve Mercia, she told him. Understood. Aldhelm nodded. He made to step past her, then turned. Should there be a time you should wish to join us again, there is no question. I, for my part, would be honored, relieved, even, to stand shoulder to shoulder with you, Osrith. In battle, any battle, in the future. He cleared his throat again. May I ask where you go? Home. Aldhelm stared at her for a moment, then nodded his head. Alba? And Osrith knew that, indeed, she would be going to Alba, to Domhnall. She just had to make it worthwhile to the King of the Scots. I found this, in the armory. Buey. It was not how she remembered her blade. She was polished, had an edge, and reached for her belt. Both absent, her sword and her Sikhs. What had she done with the 6 tags had left with her for safekeeping? Osrith was aware that Aldhelm was still staring at her. I saw to it that your blade was readied, for whenever you need it, Osrith. Her name broke into his politeness. If ever you need my help, you only have to find me. No matter what, I am your friend. And then, as Aldhelm made to stride away from her, her once commander and ally in assassination, he turned. Remember, too, Mercia is your home. But what was she going to do now? Beside her rooms, which were dusty after several weeks' lack of occupation, she could not stay in Wessex with threat of witchcraft over her, and she had just closed the door on Mercia. She walked out of the city, and on a circuitous walk around to the river, where she had often walked when she wanted to think, when she wanted to be away from the palace. Darkness came quicker than she expected, and Osrith thought she might be hungry. But she did not feel as if she could pass food beyond her jaws. But feeling sorry for herself flew away from Osrith as she spied a small figure hurrying along to the building at the back of the palace's chapel, and she followed her. A man stopped her, but it was clear Thyra did not want to speak to him, for she put her shawl over her head and hurried. Osrith avoided them by shrinking into the shadows and watched as the man followed her. A stone came out of somewhere, hitting Thyra on the back. The man picked up the pace, as did Thyra. And then Booker's wife stopped. For, when the man turned the corner, breaking into a jog, Osrith tore after him, raising buoy and piercing him between the ribs. Thyra was shaking, and she ran as fast as her child would let her. Osrith followed her, but Thyra and Booker's door was barred from the inside. Thyra! Osrith called. But Thyra did not answer. She shrank away again when, some hours later, a man came to the door, tried the latch, and then banged on the door. It was Thyra. Osrith let go of Bue's handle as she watched Thyra's husband wait for her to let him in. Booker! Thyra cried when the door opened and launched herself into Booker's arms, and Osrith could see the woman had been crying, tear rivulets reflected from the light of the full moon. What aren't you telling me? Osrith heard Booker say, as she trod silently away, heading back the opposite way to where she had killed the man. Get a plan, she told herself, as she headed in the direction of the 2 cranes, at the south of the city, before doubling back and heading towards the market square. Begin by pooling the silver, then plan your transport. You came to this city by trap and boat, these are good places to start. A bell sounded in the distance, in the direction of the palace. Birds, disturbed from their nighttime roost, fluttered into the air as doors banged sporadically.